Hey, and thanks very much for coming. And I know it's between this and the pool deck, or possibly the other session. So I appreciate your being here. This is my first pandemic work trip. It's really great to see human faces in person again like this. And I have a particular soft spot for CBRN convergence. I kind of feel like there's a little magic that Gwyn and his colleagues pulled together. So I'm always grateful to be with you. This is my third year coming and presenting to CBRN convergence. The IT guys said that the 90s called and they want their PowerPoint back. So this is going to be the least fancy slide deck you're going to see. I'm a little jealous of some of the slide decks some of you guys have. I'm a little bit of a technological Luddite and didn't have the support I usually do to craft the slide deck. So I am a 30,000-foot policy guy. I have a PhD in international relations and political science. I work on a range of CBRN-related issues, mostly in academia, a little bit in the think tank NGO world, and then I have a little bit of experience in government as well. One thing that I have in common with some of you who are more first responder types is a long time ago I was an EMT. So I have both the dark sense of humor and a little bit of appreciation for what you guys do, though only a little bit. This is a research project that's ongoing that I'm doing together with a colleague who's the deputy director of our Terrorism Research Center. So the Center on Terrorism, Extremism, and Counterterrorism is a hub for terrorism-related research on our campus, and then I am more the WMD or CBRN guy in this project. And I've got a really descriptive title, and I'll unpack that in just a sec. Let me jump right in. Quick disclaimer, as with all of us, what I'm presenting to you here represents only my personal opinions and does not reflect the policies or positions of either my current or past employers or funders. I want to give you a bluff up front. I briefly was a civilian in the Pentagon. We really like bluffs, though usually a little shorter than this. As you may be aware, a lot of domestic right-wing extremists, and I'm focusing today on domestic or US right-wing extremists. There's a little blending between the US, there's a lot of blending actually between the US right-wing extremist milieu and right-wing extremist milieus in other countries, but this particular project is scoped to specifically focus on the United States. A lot of them fetishize CBRN. So they're obsessed with CBRN. They write about it. They talk about it. They create graphic images. I'll show you a couple of them around it, as you may be aware. Of those, a subset, but I think a fairly small subset, are actually motivated to pursue it. So I think for a lot of them, it's more about an idea. It's more about an aesthetic. And we'll unpack that a little bit more through this presentation, but there is a subset that are, in fact, motivated to pursue it, and we'll unpack that more. Thankfully, that subset is mostly constrained by very limited capabilities. For many others, as I mentioned, the fixation really is more about a kind of an idea or an aesthetic. But what's also interesting is, for those actors, it appears to be a marker for both extremism and proclivity to violence. So if someone's posting a lot about nuclear weapons, for example, we might not fear that they would actually pursue a nuclear weapons plot, perhaps because of motivation and in part because of very limited capabilities, and that would be an extraordinarily challenging thing to do. But we might fear that they would become an active shooter or set off bombs or do other kinds of activity. So I think that's really interesting for this audience. More broadly, I think this idea of ideation or fixation or fetishization is really important for us to bear in mind, because it's easy to take at face value the ideas that people share. And so I think it's something that doesn't just apply to the right-wing extremist milieu, and I just want to flag it for you. My kind of bottom line here is, if you tell me that CBRN terrorism happened in the United States and future, at whatever scale, I'm going to tell you that right-wing extremists, I think, belong on the short list of potential actors who might have carried that out. So I'm a little bit agnostic on how likely I think it is, and we'll unpack that more. But I do think this is a set of actors that we should be concerned about if we're concerned about CBRN terrorism. OK, so quick roadmap. So I'm going to do a little bit of introductory fleshing out of this topic. So I'm going to tell you how I think about domestic right-wing extremists. I'm going to give you an analytical framework for thinking about CBRN terrorism and what I think CBRN terrorism specifically is. And then we'll spend some time unpacking aspects of the domestic right-wing extremist CBRN threats. My goal is to end a couple minutes early and to be able to take a few questions at the end. And then obviously, I'm happy to engage with you afterwards as well. This is one of the nicest images, actually, that we pulled off of a forum now defunct called Iron March, where a lot of right-wing extremists were congregating, in particular, some of the milieus that I would say we should be most concerned about. But this is the kind of imagery that sort of these memes, these images, this kind of fetishization of CBRN this is what I mean. And some of it shows up in writing and other forms of communication as well. Okay, right-wing extremism. There are a number of different facets of right-wing extremism in the United States. I'll talk about some of the major ones. But there's some common themes, in particular, around some of the extremes. There's a kind of a fierce exclusionary nationalism that defines a lot of the more extreme elements here, and a kind of a notion of either resurrecting or recreating some kind of revolutionary myths. So literally recreating the revolution, or sort of versions of that show up a lot. A lot of these actors are also defined by things that you might more traditionally associate with right-wing extremism, like racism, like white supremacy. And then, interestingly, both authoritarianism and anti-authoritarianism show up here in interesting ways. And then the major new development in recent years, and this development is not that new, it actually dates back a number of decades, but it's intensified, is what we label accelerationism. So this kind of apocalyptic opposition to our current governmental structures and the character of our society today, this notion that society is sort of decrepit and needs to be sort of fundamentally overthrown, and a kind of a tactic of, or strategy of, amplifying existing social divisions in order to tear down Western civilization as we know it. CBRN is really straightforward, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'm talking about chem, bio, rad, and nuke. Crucially, I want to distinguish between CBRN and WMD, so I'm talking about them across the spectrum. And I'm lumping together things that are very different in a lot of ways, and thinking, and that have some commonalities, but also some really distinct differences. And given this audience, I don't want to spend any more time on this, though certainly this is something that we can talk more about. Analytically, I'm going to disaggregate capability and motivation, and I think that's really useful, even though the two are often related. So it is both interesting to think about which actors are motivated and which might have some capability. And the good news is that they're often in opposition to each other. So often actors who are more capable are less motivated, and vice versa. I think this is true of CBRN terrorism broadly. And I think it also is true to some extent in this milieu. And then what we're really interested in is outliers, who are the exceptions to that rule, right? Who is it? Because ultimately, the only actors we're concerned about are people who combine motivation with capability, right? If you only have one, but not the other, you don't pose a threat, right? It's the actors who are both motivated and capable that we're worried about. And so trying to think systematically about who those outliers are, I think is in some respects our fundamental task. And then in terms of capability, there's a lot that one could unpack here, and I don't want to spend a lot of time here either, right? But we're talking about stuff, we're talking about information, we're talking about the skills to use the information and the stuff. Logistics is really crucial, and especially when we're talking about more complex CBRN plots. They're logistically very complicated. Funds, it really depends. There's a spectrum in terms of the sophistication of something you might be trying to pull off, and therefore the funds that you need. And one other thing I'll just note here quickly is often in threat assessment, I think delivery capabilities get short shrift. I'm particularly interested in the emerging technology of drones. I presented 2 years ago at CBRN Convergence some work on that, and that is one interesting, novel, potentially future, but in some respects already with us, way of delivering. But I just want to flag that I think often delivery capabilities get a little bit of short shrift in our threat assessments. And then in terms of motivations, you can think about this at the strategic level, at the tactical level, and at the ideological level. And all of them come together when you think about these milieux, these domestic right-wing terrorism milieux in the United States and their potential motivations to pursue CBRN. I want to generalize briefly about how I think about the CBRN terrorism threat. And this is the context in which I think about the domestic right-wing CBRN terrorism threat that we're talking about today. Most extremists have little motivation or capability to do CBRN terrorism. So that's the really good news. Of the subset with motivation, they mostly have very little capability. So that's yet further good news. And then I think there's some potential for outliers who combine more substantial motivation with more substantial capabilities. And in some respects, as I mentioned before, I think that's our fundamental analytical task, is thinking about who those might be, right, and the circumstances under which they might emerge. I would say that to date, we've had no large-scale CBRN terrorism at all. It depends a little bit on how you code a few key cases. I was part of a kind of unusual study that debriefed the Aum Shinrikyo terrorists, including the ones on death row in Japan, before they expired as a research resource a few years ago when the Japanese government finally executed them. And Aum is an interesting case. We could even talk about that further. Obviously doesn't fit within today's topic of domestic right-wing extremism. But I think it's also not implausible, to use a double negative, to think about ways in which the future might differ from the past, right? Under what circumstances might we have actors emerge who did pose more significant threats? And even non-large-scale CBRN is very problematic, as you know if you're a first responder, right? So even crude versions of these attacks, which we have seen, are challenging. So it's not just the mass destructive stuff that we should be worried about. It's another example of some of the propaganda that we see. This is also from Iron March, this now defunct forum, which is also available online as a research resource if you're interested in it. A couple quick examples of domestic right-wing extremist CBRN plots that we've seen in recent years. And I won't go through each one. If I were going to summarize them, I would say that they are what they have in common is that all of these actors had some level of motivation, were strikingly inept, and were actually delusional about what CBRN actually entailed. And we can go through the specific examples if you're interested. And in their own way, they're all interesting. And I think analytically, it's interesting to think about each of these and the ways in which they might have been more threatening than I would posit they actually were. OK, so let's unpack domestic right-wing extremism. So really, this is the heart of what you came for. Many right-wing extremists, domestic right-wing extremists, articulate really maximalist goals. They want to overthrow US society as we know it. They want to end democracy as we know it. And those are arguably consistent with and maybe only achievable with CBRN. So I think that's a meaningful concern. And a subset of them actually say that they want to pursue CBRN. So there's a kind of again, I use different words for it, but there's a kind of a fetishization or ideation or obsession with CBRN. In particular, a kind of a CBRN aesthetic. And there's a number of groups for whom this is true, and here's a couple examples on the screen. And Atomwaffendivision, which is the German word for atomic bomb, is a particularly interesting and concerning one, but there are a number that are concerning. And one of the things that's interesting about this milieu is the way in which these groups morph over time and coalesce and splinter. So taken at face value, I think there's a lot of reason to be concerned here, but I don't think we should take it at face value. A lot of the fetishization seems to be about a kind of idea or myth or aesthetic more than a direct motivation to do this. So that's good news. But people who fetishize CBRN may become motivated to do it. And some set of these actors are, in fact, motivated to do it. Differentiating those, I think, is really challenging. And as I mentioned before, this kind of ideation of CBRN, this obsession with CBRN, seems to correlate with both extremism and a proclivity to violence in general. So that's actually really useful from a law enforcement perspective, because when you see an actor talking about this, you might not be worried or as worried about a nuclear terrorism plot, but you might be worried about a bomb or a mass shooting. And then there are some actors who clearly are motivated, and in fact, CBRN weapons play a pretty central role in the ideologies of a number of these movements. A lot of you will be familiar, for example, with the Turner Diaries, where a nuclear weapons plot plays a central role. And the Turner Diaries are kind of a foundational document for certain of these groups. The good news is that most of these actors have very little capability. But I think there's some potential for outliers in ways that we really haven't seen to date. In various ways, right-wing extremists have capabilities that reduce their ability to do especially larger-scale CBRN terrorism plots. We're talking mostly about individuals or very small groups. They're mostly very decentralized. On average, they have lower educational attainment, though there are exceptions to that. There are some better organized groups. There's some who have professional expertise. One thing that's particularly concerning that I think is worth flagging in this milieu is there is some real infiltration of both military and law enforcement communities. So some of these groups have drawn members who are veterans, who are active duty military, who are actively in the police. And some of these groups have sought to infiltrate the police and the military in order to gain access to training and potentially weapons. So there's some issues here, both around stockpile security and around the particular skill sets that people in those milieus have. And obviously, there are operational issues as well around doing operations against these groups if there are leaks from the inside. And the likelihood of more capable actors emerging in future certainly possible and really hard, I think, to gauge. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the sort of strains within domestic right-wing extremism in the United States and how I think about the CBRN threat that they pose. Christian nationalists, to exclude Christian identity, which has more accelerationist characteristics, I think mostly have very little motivation in this space, in part because they're trying to change the system from within. And to be clear here, I mean extremist Christian nationalists, because Christian nationalist is a label we use much more broadly in this country to describe many actors who are within the mainstream political discourse. Survivalists mostly have low motivation. So if you think just about motivation, one could imagine, I think, scenarios where a defensive application of CBRN might be appealing. And these are actors who have a very low capability on average. Sovereign citizens are tricky. I think one can imagine much more significant CBRN implications, assassinations of political figures, for example, or law enforcement, and potential efforts to either deter or defend against threats to their autonomy or perceived threats to their autonomy. Conventional white supremacists have various possible motivations: assassinations, racial ethnic cleansing, catalyzing race war, which is kind of a maximalist goal of some in this milieu, or catalyzing a harsh crackdown from authorities. And that's one of the really interesting ones I just want to flag for you, because we often say that actors are likely to be deterred by the harsh crackdown from authorities that they're likely to trigger if they cross the line into CBRN. But I just want to flag for you that there's certain actors where that may be desirable, right? That may be not only not a negative, but that may, in fact, be desirable. They want the jackbooted thugs, as they would put it, to crack down harshly on them, because the notion is that that will rally other people in support of them. And I think that when we see that dynamic in groups, that should be concerning. And then finally, the accelerationists. And this isn't a group. This is a dynamic that we see in a number of related groups, who in part are in tension with each other. These are, but in general, the accelerationists are quite ideologically invested in CBRN. They have really maximalist apocalyptic goals that CBRN is consistent with, including societal collapse. And they fetishize the use of CBRN for the purpose of infrastructure disruption, mass casualties, catalyzing a harsh crackdown from authorities, or even catalyzing interstate war. So some of these are very extreme scenarios, and there's a kind of a break between the reality of what these actors can do, at least today, and some of what they say. So it's worth taking all of these with a really big grain of salt. And this rhetoric is really concerning. So generalizing about the different facets of CBRN, so chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. Chemical, I think, is the one we're most likely to see, right? Various chemicals are accessible, and obviously they could be used for the production of explosives or other purposes, but especially crude chemical terrorism with, for example, toxic industrial chemicals, I think is a significant concern. Versions of acid terrorism, I think you could imagine being targeted against authority figures, for example. So there's various crude modes of chemical terrorism that I would actually be surprised if we didn't see more of. And then more sophisticated versions of chemical terrorism will really hinge on capability, and particular actors who bring capability into the milieus that they're in. Biological attempts are also very likely, overwhelmingly probably ricin, but perhaps other things as well. Again, very crude, injuring perhaps no people or very few people, but that still has consequences. And then more consequential attacks really hinge on outliers who bring capability. We often say that we worry less about terrorists becoming biologists than biologists becoming terrorists. So if you have many years of experience and you become radicalized, and it happens because people burn out as postdocs because they get radicalized for various reasons, that's more of a concern than someone who doesn't have a lot of experience trying to educate themselves. I think radiological is also likely, and likely to have very modest consequences, but even modest radiological attacks are very challenging. And we've seen some episodes of accidental contamination in the United States that have been immensely challenging and costly to clean up. So radiological is fascinating because of its area denial potential, right? You don't have to scatter a lot of radiological, depending on the material, but you don't have to scatter a lot of material to deny some location and impose a costly cleanup for some period of time, and then obviously have some psychological or terrorizing effect. Nuclear, there's a fetishization of nuclear plots in this milieu. They really like the idea. this one is pretty far-fetched, right? And either the theft of a state nuclear weapons device and an ability to set that off, and there are a lot of barriers standing in the way if you were going to try to pursue that, or an improvised nuclear device where you manage to obtain sufficient fissile material, perhaps from civil facilities, not necessarily from military stockpiles, and then produce an improvised nuclear device. One can imagine that, but it's pretty far-fetched, right? That's a Tom Clancy story, or I don't know, whoever the author is who today. But this milieu fetishizes that. And when they tell you what their goals are for the most extreme elements of the milieu, they are arguably only consistent with doing this. So again, I'll flip it. If you tell me that a nuclear terrorism plot emerged domestically in the United States, I actually probably would put aspects of this milieu at the top of the list in terms of who might have tried to carry it out. Thankfully, a lot of barriers. But I think this is worth taking seriously, in part because the consequences would be so severe. So bottom line, and some worrying trends to flag for you. The good news is most of these actors lack either motivation or capability, right? So most of these actors, in terms of CBRN terrorism, we don't have to pay a lot of attention to. Some subset of them, and it's a minority, but it's a pretty substantial minority, do have motivation. For some of them, it may be more ideational, or it may be more about the idea, the concept, the aesthetic in particular. But it's hard to distinguish those from others who have real motivation, and there are actors in this milieu who have real motivation. Thankfully, with very limited capabilities. But fixation is fertile ground for not only motivation, but for bolstering their capabilities in future. And I think the infiltration of both police and military forces is concerning. So I think that's worth flagging, both in terms of the skill sets and possible access to material that people would have in that context, and also because it complicates law enforcement efforts to try to respond to this. Crude plots, I think, are very likely. And I think we're likely to see more of this in future. And even crude plots pose real challenges to human life and human health, and more broadly to the stability of society. So I don't want to, even crude plots I think are quite concerning. And then I think there's some potential for more serious plots. And I've said this about 5 times, but if you tell me that there is in fact a CBRN terrorism, including a more serious CBRN terrorism episode in the United States, these actors, I think, belong on that short list. So that's what I wanted to share with you today, and I'm happy to take comments and questions. I don't actually have a clock in my visibility, so, oh, perfect. I thought I was actually way too fast, but that's actually exactly where I wanted to be. So I'm happy to take comments and questions, and they don't need to end with a question mark. So comments are welcome as well, and I'm happy to either respond to them or not. So let's open up the floor, and then as we're doing that, I'll just flag for you the talks that I gave at CBRN Convergence the last 2 years. Last year on crude, acid, or caustic terrorism, something that we've seen spread, although in a limited way in terrorist contexts, and the year before on drones and both threat and response. And then I did an interview with Gwyn in the magazine a couple months back about some work I did on eco-radical terrorism threat assessment as well. I see a hand right here. Do we have a, or do you want to, OK, yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to say that I've been in the Chem Bio Defense Program and the counter weapons and mass destruction program for the Department of Defense for a long time. Yep. So I won't go into my background and all that. But this briefing right here was very interesting. It's not the norm. Usually what we hear is all the threats out there, and the briefings are to create this level of fear. Yep. But your briefing had an approach where it kind of marginalized a little, the CBRN threats a little bit. So it's definitely caught my attention. So I got just two things there. One, I was wondering, when you give this briefing at the OSD level, how is it received?
Sure. Yeah.
All right, that was my first question. And then my second one is, do you have any journals? I mean, I was going to email you later. I'm interested in reading some of your other material.
Sure, yeah. So actually, I want to just acknowledge that it's really provocative to come in here, especially because I'd love to be invited again next year. So, watch this space, see if I get invited back. So I am sharing with you my personal perspective. And one thing that I always say to my students, so I teach a dedicated class on CBRN terrorism, and I teach broader classes in Introduction to WMD, the field as a whole. And one thing I always say to them is, there are smart, well-informed people across the spectrum in terms of the threat perception here. My former colleague at Harvard, Rolf Mott-Larsen, who was the point person in the Department of Energy for the terrorism portfolio, who was a senior person in the CIA responsible for this portfolio as well, loses sleep over this issue. I have colleagues at the other end of the spectrum who work operational CT in different parts of the US government who think this is wildly overblown, and a make-work program for people like you and I, who, as state threats were receding, though that's much less true today, turned to the sexy new topic of terrorism and tried to build fear. I'm somewhere in the middle, and I'm maybe even a little bit more toward the I do sleep well at night than I don't sleep well at night end of the spectrum, but I just want to acknowledge that. So this is just my personal perspective, and what I think is interesting about this topic is that you can map very different assumptions about the future, because really what this is about is a future that looks different than the past. Was a big deal. The Rushnishis were a big deal. But if that's the worst of it, and we see that only every couple decades, we're doing well. And I don't want to downplay the suffering, and in particular caused a lot of suffering. But in terms of compared to explosives, compared to guns, compared to other kinds of threats. So I'm trying to be a little bit provocative. I appreciate your response to that. In government, I worked a portfolio that was more state-centric. In particular, I worked on Syrian chemical weapons before they came into play, so ways in which they might come into play in the Pentagon, and thinking about that and preparing for that. So my team helped develop the FDHS, for example, which ended up neutralizing the majority of Syria's chemical weapons and precursors at sea, as if you know that story. But there's a little bit of the threat assessment conversation there, but mostly the conversation is the president says this is a priority, or the National Security Council says this is a priority, or this strategy document says this is a priority, and we're implementers. So at least in my office, that's more where the conversation was. But this is a topic I love discussing with people, and I discussed it with a lot of mid-level and more senior folks to see where they landed. Can you remind me what the second question was, so I can briefly respond to it, and then we'll... Oh yeah, so I have a faculty page. So my name, the spelling of my name is a little bit unusual. Actually, I'm not sure there's another one of me out there. And so if you Google me, you can find my faculty page, and almost all my publications are linked to that, including all my, so Gwyn's let me put PDFs of my CBRN World publications up there as well. So, and I'm happy to engage also. Do we have? Yeah, often I think there's an inverse relationship here, but not always. Do we have time for another question? Or I don't want to have us be running late. OK, I'll be quick. I know I was.
You talked about the intersection between motivation and capability, and anyone with eyes or ears sees motivation.
Sees motivation.
Anybody with eyes and ears can see the motivation,
Yep.
and I think the trend is clear there. The question on capability, you do say that not too capable, small set of people, small.
Yep.
Will you comment on the trend of capability, increasing capability with technology as accessible as it is today, with instruction manuals out there?
Yep.
Talk about that trend.
Yeah, so really briefly, in part because I don't want to run over time, there are trends over time that are making these technologies more accessible. And that's concerning, right? So the internet and the access to information there, 3D printing has some interesting implications in the intersection with drugs and other contexts in which chemicals traffic in illicit forums is concerning, illicit Botox, and there's a lot of things that are concerning. I think those are very gradual processes, so they're not switches that flip. On the spectrum, they shift us a little bit, and it takes a lot of sophistication to use that information. Right? It turns out that even for chemical weapons, following the recipe, thankfully, is often really challenging, especially if you're trying to do something more sophisticated, like a state warfare agent. But there's some things that aren't so sophisticated, that aren't like various cyanide compounds are really readily accessible. Chlorine is readily accessible. So there are things that you can do where you can inflict some real harm. And so I think there's a shift over time, but I think we tend to exaggerate it. So it's not a switch that flips. And there's a lot of complications. And it doesn't just require and I'll close on this thought, this doesn't just require sophistication. It also requires patience. Right? The more sophisticated plots are, and some actors have patience, right? Al-Qaeda had patience. It was willing to wait months or years for plots to come to fruition. Most of these actors don't have patience. They want something to go boom right away. So that, I think, is yet another reason why we can be a little more optimistic about domestic right-wing extremist CBRN threats. And then there's some exceptions to that rule. There are people who have very long-term agendas. Thankfully, they're mostly not very capable and even delusional about the capabilities that they do have. But I think there's some real potential for exceptions to that. So with that, let's wrap up just so we stay on time. Thank you. I would love to engage with you more over the next day and a half of the conference. And thank you for giving me a little bit of your attention, especially right after lunch. So.
Thank you, Dr. Bleek. Very good presentation.